It was the first week of December, and the air in the neighborhood carried the crisp chill of winter. The leaves that once painted the streets in shades of amber and gold had fallen, leaving bare branches that rattled gently in the wind. Houses stood neat and orderly, identical in their beige tones and carefully trimmed hedges. This was the kind of neighborhood where the Homeowners Association dictated everything, right down to the color of mailboxes. Among these houses was one that stood out, not because it broke the rules, but because it radiated warmth. Inside lived a family that cherished Christmas more than any other time of the year. Each December, they unpacked boxes of lights, ornaments, and festive decorations, turning their modest home into a beacon of joy. For them, the lights weren't just decoration, they were tradition, a way to bring hope and happiness into the season. That year, they began their usual preparations. The father climbed ladders, stringing colorful bulbs across the roofline. The mother checked each strand, making sure the lights glowed evenly. Their children laughed as they placed inflatable snowmen and reindeer across the yard. It was a ritual that drew smiles not only from the family, but from neighbors who had grown accustomed to the cheerful sight. But not everyone smiled. Across the street lived a woman who prided herself on being the enforcer of the HOA rules. Her name had become synonymous with complaints, warnings, and confrontations. She was the kind of neighbor who measured grass blades, checked trash bins for placement, and carried the rule book of the Homeowners Association like it was sacred scripture. To most, she was simply Karen. When Karen saw the twinkling bulbs going up before her very eyes, her expression hardened. In her mind, the lights were not festive joy, but a violation waiting to be punished. She watched with disapproval as strands of bright red and green stretched across the eaves, as glowing candy canes were planted by the walkway, and as a shining star was prepared for the peak of the roof. By the time night fell, the house lit up for the first time that season. It wasn't extravagant, not yet, but it was beautiful. Soft glows of red, green, and white shimmered in the darkness, casting reflections on the snow-dusted lawns. Neighbors paused their walks just to admire it, and children's faces lit up with excitement. But inside Karen's home, the curtains snapped shut. She sat at her desk, pen in hand, drafting the first of many complaints. She believed she had the power to control what her neighbors displayed, and she was determined to stamp out what she considered unnecessary clutter. The next morning, the family found a letter tucked into their mailbox. It was official, stamped with the HOA's seal, citing alleged violations about unauthorized exterior decorations. The letter demanded removal within 72 hours. The family was stunned. For years, they had decorated without issue, always within reasonable limits. Why now? Why them? Confusion quickly turned to frustration, and frustration into quiet defiance. They knew this wasn't about decorations. It was about control, and Karen thrived on control. Instead of taking down the lights, the family decided to keep them glowing. Each night they flipped the switch, filling their corner of the neighborhood with warmth. And each night, Karen seethed as she watched from across the street, already plotting her next move. Word spread quickly among the neighbors. Some shook their heads, knowing all too well about Karen's antics. Others rallied behind the family, offering words of support. A few even mentioned adding their own lights to show solidarity. A quiet storm was brewing, one that Karen had unknowingly ignited with her single complaint. That week, the family began to notice something peculiar. More neighbors than usual lingered outside in the evenings, admiring the lights. Cars slowed down, passengers pointing and smiling. Children tugged at their parents' hands, asking to walk past the house again. The decorations were doing what they were meant to, bringing joy. But they were also doing something else. They were uniting the neighborhood against the shadow of Karen's complaints. By the time the 72 hours had passed, the lights still shone bright, and on the fourth night, something remarkable happened. The house next door strung a few strands of lights across its roof. The following night, another neighbor hung a glowing wreath. Slowly but surely, the entire street began to twinkle. Karen had wanted silence and conformity. Instead, she had sparked the beginning of something far greater than she could control. The family didn't know it yet, but their small act of resistance would soon grow into the largest, brightest display the town had ever seen. And Karen, with her endless complaints, was about to find herself at the center of a storm she had unleashed with her own hand. The lights were no longer just decorations. They were a symbol. And symbols once ignited cannot easily be extinguished. The morning after the 72-hour deadline passed, Karen awoke with a sense of fury. She had expected compliance. She had expected fear. But instead of submission, she saw defiance glowing from across the street in the form of bright, cheerful Christmas lights. To her, it wasn't just a matter of decorations. It was an attack on her authority. She stormed into the HOA office, clutching her written complaints, her heels clicking sharply against the tiled floor. The board, a small group of weary volunteers, listened as Karen ranted about unauthorized displays and neighborhood uniformity. But her words fell on tired ears. Most of the board members had grown numb to her constant tirades. Still, she persisted, insisting that immediate fines be levied against the family. By that evening, another letter arrived. This one was harsher, threatening escalating fines and legal action if the decorations were not removed. The family read the letter with a mix of disbelief and irritation. What had once been a simple celebration was now turning into a battle. But they weren't alone anymore. Neighbors had begun quietly rallying behind them, inspired by their courage to resist. The house next door added more lights. Across the street, a family placed a glowing nativity scene in their yard. Each act of decoration was a statement. If one house was being targeted, the rest would stand in solidarity. Karen, however, saw it differently. To her, this was rebellion, and rebellions, in her mind, required swift and merciless punishment. She began patrolling the neighborhood with a clipboard in hand, jotting down every perceived violation. Trash bins left out a minute too long. Lawns that weren't perfectly edged. Cars parked slightly off-center. Each observation became ammunition for her crusade to assert control. The neighborhood began to feel the tension. Conversations that were once about recipes and school events turned into whispered discussions about fines and letters. Children who once waved at Karen now avoided her altogether, sensing the hostility she carried like a storm cloud. Meanwhile, the family at the center of it all remained calm. They had no intention of removing their lights. If anything, the growing support of their neighbors strengthened their resolve. They began to dream bigger. What if this year's display wasn't just for their family, but for the entire community? What if, instead of hiding in fear, everyone came together in celebration? That idea took root in their minds, and soon plans began forming. They purchased extra strands of lights, more decorations, and even rented a projector to cast festive scenes across their garage door. Friends and neighbors volunteered to help, eager to contribute to the cause. Every night, after work and school, they gathered to add more sparkle, more color, more joy. Karen's rage only deepened as she watched the neighborhood transform. What began as a single decorated house was now becoming an entire street of glowing defiance. She fired off complaint after complaint, but the sheer number of households involved overwhelmed even her relentless energy. In her desperation, Karen made a fateful decision. She contacted the city's zoning department, hoping to find some obscure regulation that would force the family, and by extension the neighborhood, to comply. She envisioned inspectors arriving, tickets being written, and her authority restored. But the city officials, upon receiving her frantic calls and detailed complaints, decided to investigate not the lights, but the behavior of the HOA itself. After all, they reasoned, Christmas lights were hardly a public menace. Karen's obsession had now drawn the attention of those far beyond the neighborhood, and her iron grip was beginning to weaken. Unaware of this brewing backlash, Karen doubled down. She began walking door to door, demanding that neighbors take down their lights, warning of heavy fines and legal consequences. Some were intimidated, but many were emboldened by the solidarity of the community. Instead of backing down, they added even more decorations. The once quiet street was now alive with color and sparkle. Each night, the glow grew brighter, the laughter louder, and the spirit of unity stronger. Families who had never spoken much before began working together, sharing extension cords and ladders, creating bonds that Karen's hostility could never break. And yet, even as joy spread across the neighborhood, a storm was building. Karen was not finished. She was preparing her most aggressive move yet, a formal lawsuit filed through the HOA. The family didn't know it yet, but the fight was about to escalate far beyond letters and complaints. This battle over Christmas lights was becoming a battle over freedom, community, and the right to resist control. The neighborhood began to feel the tension. Conversations that were once about recipes and school events turned into whispered discussions about fines and letters. Children who once waved at Karen now avoided her altogether, sensing the hostility she carried like a storm cloud. Meanwhile, the family at the center of it all remained calm. They had no intention of removing their lights. If anything, the growing support of their neighbors strengthened their resolve. They began to dream bigger. What if this year's display wasn't just for their family, but for the entire community? What if, instead of hiding in fear, everyone came together in celebration? That idea took root in their minds, and soon, plans began forming. They purchased extra strands of lights, more decorations, and even rented a projector to cast festive scenes across their garage door. Friends and neighbors volunteered to help, eager to contribute to the cause. Every night, after work and school, they gathered to add more sparkle, more color, more joy. Karen's rage only deepened as she watched the neighborhood transform. What began as a single decorated house was now becoming an entire street of glowing defiance. She fired off complaint after complaint, but the sheer number of households involved overwhelmed even her relentless energy. In her desperation, Karen made a fateful decision. She contacted the city's zoning department, hoping to find some obscure regulation that would force the family, and by extension, the neighborhood, to comply. She envisioned inspectors arriving, tickets being written, and her authority restored. But the city officials, upon receiving her frantic calls and detailed complaints, decided to investigate not the lights, but the behavior of the HOA itself. After all, they reasoned, Christmas lights were hardly a public menace. Karen's obsession had now drawn the attention of those far beyond the neighborhood, and her iron grip was beginning to weaken. Unaware of this brewing backlash, Karen doubled down. She began walking door to door, demanding that neighbors take down their lights, warning of heavy fines and legal consequences. Some were intimidated, but many were emboldened by the solidarity of the community. Instead of backing down, they added even more decorations. The once quiet street was now alive with color and sparkle. Each night, the glow grew brighter, the laughter louder, and the spirit of unity stronger. Families who had never spoken much before began working together, sharing extension cords and ladders, creating bonds that Karen's hostility could never break. And yet, even as joy spread across the neighborhood, a storm was building. Karen was not finished. She was preparing her most aggressive move yet, a formal lawsuit filed through the HOA. The family didn't know it yet, but the fight was about to escalate far beyond letters and complaints. This battle over Christmas lights was becoming a battle over freedom, community, and the right to resist control. As the second week of December approached, the neighborhood glowed brighter than ever before. Cars from outside the community began to drive by, slowing down to admire the dazzling displays. Children pressed their noses against car windows in awe. What started as one house's lights was quickly becoming a spectacle that people from all over town wanted to see. Karen stood in her darkened living room, curtains drawn tightly, glaring out at the glowing rebellion. In her heart, she believed she still had the power to stop it. But the tide had already turned, and when she made her next move, she would discover that not even the HOA could silence the spirit she had accidentally unleashed. By mid-December, the neighborhood had transformed into something magical. Every night, as darkness fell, the street erupted into a cascade of colors. Strings of lights draped across rooftops, glowing reindeer leapt through front yards, and inflatable Santas waved cheerfully at passers-by. The hum of generators and the scent of hot cocoa mingled in the air as families gathered outside to admire what they had built together. The once ordinary cul-de-sac was now a spectacle that drew attention from across the city. Cars lined up to drive slowly past the glowing homes, their headlights dimmed in reverence to the radiance ahead. Strangers stopped to take photos, children giggled in delight, and local news stations began to notice. But behind the curtains of one house, there was no joy, only bitterness. Karen sat hunched over her dining table, papers scattered around her like a general plotting a war. Each complaint letter, each citation draft, each note of violation was a weapon in her arsenal. The HOA had begun to waver under the pressure of the community, their volunteers tired of endless complaints. But Karen was not ready to concede. If the HOA board wouldn't fight with the same zeal, she would force them to. And so, with her pen scratching furiously, she prepared the most drastic measure yet. A formal lawsuit filed in the name of the HOA against the family who had dared to defy her. She cited zoning codes, obscure association bylaws, and exaggerated claims of public nuisance. Her argument was simple. If the family would not bend, they must be broken. When the letter arrived at the family's door, it carried not just a threat but a demand to appear in court. Shock rippled through their home. What had begun as a simple holiday tradition had escalated into a legal battle. Yet fear quickly gave way to resolve. For the family, this was no longer just about Christmas lights. It was about standing up to a system that sought to crush joy beneath the weight of control. And as word spread, the entire neighborhood rallied even harder. Neighbors gathered in living rooms, discussing strategies and pooling resources. One offered legal advice, another volunteered to testify, and others promised to show up in court to lend their voices. The family was no longer standing alone. They were the face of a movement that had grown out of defiance, unity, and the simple glow of Christmas lights. Karen, however, believed she still held the upper hand. She pictured the courtroom filled with stern judges who would see the lights as a violation of order. She envisioned the decorations being torn down by force, vindicating her crusade. What she didn't see, what she couldn't see, was how much the tide of public opinion had shifted. The lawsuit became a topic far beyond the neighborhood. The local news reported on the story, framing it as a battle between joy and control, between one family's holiday spirit and an HOA's rigid enforcement. Reporters flocked to the glowing street, cameras capturing the dazzling displays. Interviews with smiling neighbors painted a picture of unity, while Karen's refusal to speak to the press only deepened her image as the villain. As court day approached, something extraordinary happened. Donations began to pour in from outside the neighborhood. People who had never set foot on that street contributed money to help cover legal fees. Local businesses offered to sponsor decorations, seeing an opportunity to stand on the side of community spirit. What started as a fight over one house's lights had now become a cause that people across the city rallied behind. And still, each night, the lights grew brighter. More decorations appeared. The family added synchronized music to their display, speakers filling the air with holiday songs. Cars no longer just drove by, they parked, entire families stepping out to watch the show. The cul-de-sac had transformed into a festival ground, and the spirit of celebration drowned out Karen's bitterness. But inside her darkened house, Karen seethed. She couldn't understand why no one else saw what she saw: disorder, chaos, and a neighborhood slipping out of control. She convinced herself that victory was still possible. All she had to do was win in court. The night before the hearing, the family stood in their front yard, gazing at the glowing display they had created. It wasn't just lights anymore. It was a symbol of resilience, unity, and joy. They knew the next day would be difficult, perhaps even costly. But as they looked around at the neighbors who had stood by them, at the children sipping cocoa with wide-eyed wonder, they felt something deeper than fear. They felt ready. The morning of the court date arrived with a heavy silence. Karen walked into the courthouse with her papers neatly stacked, her chin held high, convinced she was about to restore order. The family arrived shortly after, flanked by neighbors and friends who filled the gallery with quiet support. Reporters lined the steps outside, cameras rolling, waiting to capture the outcome of what had become the city's most talked-about holiday feud. As the judge entered and the proceedings began, the battle that Karen had escalated to its highest level was finally underway. What she had intended as her ultimate weapon was about to become the very stage where her control began to crumble. The courthouse stood tall against the pale winter sky, its stone facade echoing with the footsteps of those who entered. Inside, the air carried a tension thicker than the December chill outside. For most cases that day, the rooms would be filled with disputes over traffic tickets or minor civil matters. But in one particular courtroom, a far more unusual battle was about to unfold, a fight over Christmas lights. Karen sat stiffly at the plaintiff's table, her stack of papers arranged with meticulous precision. She wore her sternest expression, as though she alone bore the burden of restoring order to a chaotic world. To her, this was not about lights. It was about principle, about obedience, about showing the neighborhood who was in charge. Across the room, the family sat together, their faces calm but resolute. They were not alone. Behind them, rows of neighbors filled the benches, their presence a silent wall of support. Some clutched photos of the light displays. Others carried petitions signed by dozens of residents, all showing solidarity. Reporters lined the back wall, pens ready, cameras waiting to capture the drama as it unfolded. The judge, a middle-aged man with graying hair and tired eyes, surveyed the room with curiosity. It was not every day that his docket featured something so unusual. As he called the case to order, the murmurs of the crowd hushed into silence. Karen rose first, her voice sharp and deliberate as she outlined her case. She spoke of unauthorized displays, of neighborhood uniformity, and of light pollution. She waved bylaws in the air, citing obscure clauses that few had ever heard of. To her, these lights represented rebellion against order, and rebellion could not be tolerated. She urged the judge to impose heavy fines, to demand immediate removal, and to reinforce the authority of the HOA. Her words echoed across the room, but the faces of the audience revealed little sympathy. To them, her arguments sounded less like justice and more like obsession. When it was the family's turn, they did not speak of rebellion or defiance. Instead, they spoke of tradition, of joy, of the simple desire to bring happiness to their children and neighbors. They described how the lights had become more than decorations, how they had united a community, brought families together, and even lifted spirits during difficult times. They presented testimonies from neighbors who stood in support, each one reinforcing the same message: the lights were not a nuisance, they were a gift. The judge listened intently, his gaze shifting between the icy determination of Karen and the heartfelt sincerity of the family. At one point, he even leaned forward as photographs of the neighborhood displays were presented, showing a street transformed into a wonderland of color and light. The images were striking, filled with laughter, joy, and unity. Karen grew restless. She interrupted often, objecting, insisting that feelings had no place in law. To her, this was black and white. Rules had been broken, and consequences must follow. But with each outburst, her frustration became more apparent, and her carefully crafted image of authority began to crack. Then came the turning point. One of the neighbors took the stand, a quiet elderly man who had lived in the community for decades. He spoke softly, but his words carried weight. He described how the lights had reminded him of his childhood, how they had given him comfort in his loneliness, and how they had made him feel part of something larger than himself. The courtroom fell silent as he spoke, and even the judge seemed moved by the sincerity in his voice. By the time testimonies concluded, it was clear where the momentum had shifted. What had started as a case about technical violations had become something much deeper, a story about community, unity, and the power of joy in the face of control. When the judge finally delivered his ruling, his voice was steady. He acknowledged the HOA's role in maintaining order, but emphasized that rules must serve the people, not oppress them. He dismissed Karen's demands for removal, ruling that the lights could remain. Furthermore, he cautioned the HOA against using its power to stifle harmless expressions of joy. The gavel struck, and the courtroom erupted in quiet cheers. The family embraced, neighbors clapped, and reporters rushed to capture the moment. Cameras flashed, pens scribbled, and within hours, the story began to spread across the city. But amidst the celebration, one figure remained unmoved. Karen sat rigidly, her face pale with disbelief. This was supposed to be her victory, her moment of triumph. Instead, she had been publicly humiliated. Her authority shattered not just in the courtroom, but in the eyes of the entire community. As she gathered her papers and left in silence, the family and their neighbors walked out into the crisp winter air, greeted by cameras and cheers. The judge's ruling was not just a legal victory, it was a symbolic one. The lights would shine brighter than ever, and now nothing stood in their way. But what no one expected was how far the story would spread in the days to come. The small neighborhood battle was about to capture attention far beyond the city limits. The courtroom victory was only the beginning. By the evening of the ruling, news stations across the city aired the story of the neighborhood that stood up to an HOA enforcer and won. Clips of the dazzling lights, the joyful crowds, and the triumphant family filled television screens, painting the picture of a community united in celebration. Within days, the story spread further. Social media posts began to circulate, videos of the synchronized lights dancing to music, photos of children posing with inflatable snowmen, and heartfelt captions about the power of community. Hashtags appeared, growing by the hour, as people from neighboring towns shared their excitement. The street was no longer just a neighborhood. It was becoming a destination. Cars began lining up earlier each evening, headlights stretching down the road as families waited their turn to see the now famous display. Food trucks appeared, serving hot chocolate and festive treats to the growing crowds. Musicians brought instruments, playing carols on the sidewalks as children danced. What had started as one family's lights had transformed into a festival unlike anything the city had seen. The mayor himself visited, shaking hands with neighbors and praising the spirit of unity. Local businesses sponsored additional decorations, donating enormous glowing arches and giant Christmas trees to add to the spectacle. Charities joined in, collecting donations for families in need, turning the event into not just entertainment, but an act of giving. And through it all, the family at the center of it watched in awe. What they had begun as a simple tradition had now grown into something much larger, a beacon of joy that brought together thousands of people. Their home, once the target of complaints and fines, had become the symbol of hope for an entire city. But not everyone saw it that way. From behind the darkened windows of her house, Karen watched the crowds grow night after night. Where once she held sway over the neighborhood, she now felt invisible, her authority stripped away. The sound of laughter and music outside only deepened her bitterness. She had tried to stop the lights, and instead, they had become unstoppable. Her complaints fell on deaf ears. The HOA, once her weapon of control, had grown weary of her constant battles. After the court ruling, they wanted nothing to do with her crusade. Neighbors avoided her, conversations cut short when she approached. She had become the villain in her own story, and she felt the sting of isolation more deeply with each passing night. But even in her bitterness, she refused to let go. She filed new complaints with the city, calling the police for noise disturbances, insisting that traffic was unsafe, and demanding that the event be shut down. Each attempt failed, brushed aside as officials recognized the community's spirit and the overwhelming support the lights had garnered. Meanwhile, the celebration only grew. National news outlets picked up the story, broadcasting it to millions. Families from miles away drove in just to see the glowing street that had defied an HOA. Donations poured in, funding even more decorations. The neighborhood became a landmark, its lights visible from blocks away, its joy impossible to ignore. For the family, it was overwhelming but beautiful. Their evenings were filled with handshakes, hugs, and gratitude from strangers who came to see the lights. They were no longer just homeowners. They were hosts of a citywide tradition. Karen, however, felt cornered. The more the lights shone, the darker her world seemed. She told herself she had been wronged, that the neighborhood had turned against her, that the rules no longer mattered. She clung desperately to the belief that somehow she could still regain control. But the truth was undeniable. The harder she fought, the brighter the lights became, and the more people celebrated what she had tried to destroy. The climax of the season came on Christmas Eve. The entire street glowed brighter than ever before, every house bathed in color, music echoing through the air. Thousands of people gathered, filling the sidewalks, singing carols together in unison. A sense of unity and warmth spread through the crowd, as if the lights themselves carried the power to heal divisions and bring people together. It was a moment of triumph, the kind of moment that would be remembered for years to come. The neighborhood had stood against control, against bitterness, and against one woman's obsession, and they had emerged stronger, brighter, and more united than ever. But in the shadows of that joyous night, Karen stood alone in her darkened yard, watching the glow she could not stop. Her war against Christmas had not only failed, it had made her the most despised figure in the community. And yet, even then, she was not ready to let go. For as the final song ended and the crowd cheered, Karen turned away with a cold determination. If the lights could not be stopped by rules, fines, or lawsuits, she would find another way. The neighborhood had won the battle, but Karen was not finished. The night of Christmas Eve had been a triumph. The lights glowed brighter than ever. The voices of thousands rose in song, and the joy that radiated through the neighborhood seemed unstoppable. For most, it was the perfect ending to a story of unity and resilience. But in one darkened house, the story was not over. Karen sat alone, the glow from the street spilling faintly through the edges of her curtains. Each cheer from the crowd felt like a dagger. Each burst of laughter reminded her of how far she had fallen. Once, she was feared as the HOA's enforcer, the keeper of order. Now she was mocked, ignored, and cast aside. The court had dismissed her, the HOA had abandoned her, and the neighbors had turned her into a villain. Her bitterness hardened into something sharper. She convinced herself that if no authority would stop the lights, she would take matters into her own hands. That night, long after the crowds had left and the street had quieted, Karen stepped outside. She carried with her a pair of scissors and a grim resolve. She moved through the shadows, her eyes fixed on the cords that powered the glowing displays. To her, this was not vandalism. It was justice. It was her last chance to restore control. But what she did not realize was that the neighborhood was no longer asleep in silence. Security cameras watched from multiple angles, motion sensors lit up driveways, and some neighbors, still buzzing from the festivities, lingered awake. As Karen crept toward the cords, a light flicked on. A voice called out. Dogs barked. Cameras whirred silently, capturing every move. By morning, the footage was everywhere. The once secret enforcer of HOA rules was caught red-handed, attempting to sabotage the very lights she had sworn to remove. The video spread like wildfire, first among neighbors, then across the city, and finally online, where thousands shared it as yet another chapter in the now legendary Christmas story. This time, there would be consequences she could not control. The HOA, embarrassed by her behavior, issued a public statement distancing themselves from her actions. She was removed from all committees, stripped of any influence she had once wielded. Neighbors who had tolerated her before now avoided her completely, unwilling to forgive her attempt to destroy what they had built together. Even the city weighed in. Officials warned that further tampering with private property could result in criminal charges. Karen, who once wielded the HOA handbook like a weapon, now stood exposed, her reputation ruined, her authority gone. Meanwhile, the family and their neighbors continued to shine brighter than ever. The lights became a permanent tradition, something the community looked forward to every year. What had begun as a simple act of defiance had grown into a festival that drew thousands annually, a celebration that symbolized unity, resilience, and the triumph of joy over control. On New Year's Eve, as the final fireworks burst above the glowing street, the family stood with their neighbors, reflecting on what they had created together. The lights had brought them more than victory. They had brought friendships, memories, and a sense of community stronger than anything they had known before. And as the final cheer echoed through the night, there was no trace of Karen in the celebration. She remained in her darkened house, a solitary figure who had tried to fight joy and lost. Her war was over. The neighborhood had won. The lights would shine every year, a constant reminder that even the harshest voices of control cannot dim the glow of unity and kindness. And so, what started as one woman's complaint had become a legend, a story passed on year after year, told with laughter and pride. The story of how a single string of Christmas lights sparked a movement that lit up an entire city.